Patterns often instruct the knitter to slip a stitch. Sometimes they tell you to slip as if to purl, but sometimes as if to knit. Sometimes they ask you to reposition the yarn before slipping the stitch, but other times they don't. Sometimes the pattern tells you to slip a stitch, but doesn't say which way to do it. In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'm going to explain the reasons why slipping instructions vary, so that when you have a pattern that doesn't tell you which way to slip, you will know what to do. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen in order to see the chapter titles of each section and their starting points. Or you can use the time-stamped links down in the video description. So for this video, we will not be talking about slipping selvage stitches, that first and last stitch of the row. We're going to be talking about only those stitches that are between the selvage stitches, so every other stitch except the selvage stitches. I want to start with slipping as if to purl and what that means and what its purpose is. So when you are asked to slip as if to purl, the point is to move the stitch off of the needle where it currently is onto another needle, and you want that stitch to sit on the new needle in the same way that it's sitting on the existing needle. So if we look at these stitches on the needles, what we can see is that the leading leg, that is the leg of the stitch that is closest to the tip, is over the front over the front of the needle. You can see right here that this leg over the front of the needle is the leg that is attached to the stitch to its right. That is the leading leg. It's the leg that's leading the stitch off the needle. This is called a western mount, and this is the stitch mount that is assumed in your knitting patterns. So when they say to slip as if to purl, you would be using your working needle to enter that stitch just like you were going to purl it, and you would just move it to the other needle. So this is slipping all of these stitches as if to purl, like this. All of these stitches have a western mount. So this is a technique that you would use if you were moving stitches to a stitch holder, or if you were moving stitches onto waste yarn. You would use your yarn needle and you would enter each of these stitches as if to purl, like this, and the stitches would end up on this yarn needle the same way that they were sitting on the original needle, and you can just keep passing them to your needle until you have quite a few on there, and then you can pull it onto the waste yarn. So this is a technique that you would use if you need to move stitches to stitch holder or to waste yarn. There are some knitters who are Eastern knitters, and that means all of their stitches, whether they're knitting or purling, all of their stitches end up with the leading leg over the back of the needle. And in this case, you would also, if you were instructed as if to purl, the intent is to maintain the stitch mount. So you can also enter through this front leg here. This is not how you would be purling these stitches. If you were an Eastern knitter, you would be entering in through the back here in order to purl. If you were an Eastern knitter, your stitches are mounted like this. The point is to keep them mounted like this. So you would also come through this front leg like this in order to maintain this particular stitch mount when you are working. Now some knitters are combination knitters, so some of their stitches might be mounted with this Eastern mount and some might be mounted with a Western mount, and that's usually associated with the fact that they knit in a Western manner but they purl in an Eastern pattern. And again, the point would be to maintain the stitch mount. So regardless of whether you have the leading leg over the front or the back, you can maintain that stitch mount for all of the stitches by slipping through that leg that's hanging over the front, whether that leg is the trailing leg or the leading leg. So another example of a stitch holder is a cable needle. So if you are working cables, then you want to slip the stitches as I've shown you before so that you're maintaining the stitch mount. So you would come through that leg that's over the front of the needle like this. And this is just holding these stitches temporarily while you work the next couple of stitches, and then you would just work the stitches off the cable needle. So you treat this just like a stitch holder, and you would slip them as if to purl, just like with any other stitch holder. In this stitch pattern, you alternate between slipping a stitch and knitting a stitch when you are on the right side rows, and then on the wrong side rows, you just purl across all of the stitches. And in this case, I'm going to be working a selvage stitch differently, so ignore that because we're not talking about selvage stitches today. So this is second stitch is knit, and then I have to slip as if to purl. I'm keeping the yarn in back. There's no, just because I'm slipping as if to purl does not mean that I need to move the yarn in front as if I were purling. I keep the yarn where it is unless I'm specifically told that I need to move the yarn. So all the way across this row, I'm knitting a stitch, and then I'm slipping as if to purl, knitting a stitch, slipping as if to purl, all the way across. These stitches that were actually worked have purl bumps underneath them, and the stitches that weren't worked, that were slipped, you can see that there's just that strand of yarn that stretches across the back of those stitches. So that horizontal strand of yarn is kept on the wrong side of the work for this particular type of slip stitch pattern where you are not instructed to move the yarn. So this is a stitch pattern where I am also going to be alternating between knitting a stitch and slipping a stitch. In this case, I'm going to start with a knit stitch, and then I'm going to slip a stitch, but I'm going to bring the yarn forward, and then I'm going to slip as if to purl. And after I've slipped it, then I'm going to bring the yarn back in order to knit the next stitch. So in this case, we want that strand to go across the right side of the work because it's being used as part of the stitch pattern to create a decorative effect. But in this stitch pattern, it would be clearly stated that you were to bring the yarn in front while you were slipping it. You would be directly told to do that. So far we've been talking about slipping as if to purl, and that the point of that is to maintain the stitch mount. So however that stitch is mounted on the needle, you want to maintain that as you slip it. And I've shown that you can do that regardless of how the stitch is mounted on the needle. The point of slipping as if to knit is to change the stitch mount, but it's specifically to change the stitch mount of a Western mounted stitch. So this is what the patterns assume, that you are working with a Western mounted stitch with the leading leg over the front of the needle. And the reason that you are asked to slip as if to knit is to change that stitch mount so that the leading leg hangs over the back. Slipping as if to knit is one of the steps of many different kinds of decreases. Not all decreases need you to slip as if to knit first, but quite a few of them do. And so this is all part of that. So unlike slipping as if to purl, where you're maintaining the stitch mount and you're forgetting about that stitch for the rest of the row, slipping as if to knit is just the first step of several steps that are going to create a decrease. So one common decrease is to slip that that stitch as if to knit, and then to actually knit the next stitch. And then you would pass that slip stitch over that knit stitch. So by remounting that first stitch, it allows you to pass it over the knit stitch so that you end up with a decrease that is not twisted at the base. If you had instead just slipped as if to purl and then knit that stitch and then pass that over, you would end up with a stitch that is crossed at the base. So there are a lot of decreases that involve slipping stitches as if to knit. With double decreases, there are even more ways of slipping stitches. There is a decrease called a central double decrease, where this center stitch ends up on top of the other two. And it's done by slipping 2 stitches together as if you were knitting them together. So you move them to this needle. That not only remounts the stitches, but it reorders them. It switches the order of those stitches so that after you knit the 3rd stitch and then you pass these 2 stitches over the top, that is what's going to produce that untwisted result with that middle stitch on top. When you come across instructions for slipping as if to knit, remember that the assumption is that your stitches are sitting on the needle with a Western mount. If you are an Eastern knitter or a combination knitter, you will need different instructions for producing those decreases. So that's just something to be aware of. That's not something I can cover in this video today, but it is something that you need to look for. And just be aware of that is why a pattern is asking you to slip as if to knit. So if your pattern does not tell you how to slip a stitch, if it's not telling you as if to knit or as if to purl, look at what you're doing with that stitch for the rest of the row. If you are just being asked to slip that stitch and it is not being worked in any way, then you are going to be slipping as if to purl. If the pattern does not instruct you to move the yarn before you slip the stitch, then do not move the yarn. You will only move the yarn if the instructions tell you to do so. I'll be doing a video very soon on slipping selvage stitches, as well as several aimed at Eastern and combination knitters. In the meantime, you might be interested in this video over here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.